Kevin Gibbs. I am with Hickey and Associates. Today we'll be talking about deploying labor analytics to measure the rural workforce. I think we are going to begin now. We have enough attendees, and let us launch into this presentation. Thank you. Well, to begin, we'd like to describe a little bit about our firm. Hickey and Associates is a full-service global site selection and incentive consulting management firm. And we've been assisting companies with site selection, labor analytics, and in securing and managing incentives for over 30 years. Some recent awards that we've received include this Editor's Choice for Site Selection Magazine. We support CoreNet with our Deal of the Year and major economic development deals. SIOR membership is also supported with our location strategy incentives and other services that we provide to the SIOR members. The Institute for Professionals in Taxation is a collaborator with us, and we develop materials for them, including continuing education credits and curriculum development, as well as hosting seminars for their membership. And finally, Thomson Reuters licenses our Global Incentive Database, which is a database of all incentives across the globe, not just in North America. We, again, are a 30-year-old firm, began in 1986 in providing site selection and workforce solution services. We have offices across the world and subject matter expertise in each one of those offices, just representing just about every continent except, I think, Africa and Antarctica. Some of our service offerings include site selection and advisory services, economic development incentive capture and research, and as well incentive management and aftercare and compliance. We also help research and acquire complex incentives such as new market tax credits or historic tax credits. I like to conduct a lot of labor analytics, and this presentation will be talking about those labor analytics as they pertain to rural areas, which we see a lot happening. You might think you don't live in a rural area, but we see a lot happening right on the fringes of metropolitan areas, kind of the new wave of development that happens at the edges of these areas, formerly rural sites that are now being absorbed by the metropolitan area. So this is why we're giving this presentation today, to describe what we can do to help you understand labor in those areas. We also manage and capture training grants and workforce development funding. We conducted the logistic network studies. I've done many of those myself, and I would be happy to help you. And again, this is a global expertise. It's not just in the United States. We have offices and subject matter experts throughout the world. So location strategy, there are some key factors that we need to focus on when we're looking at different strategies for site selection. One, obviously, is the workforce availability and the type of skills that labor has. We also want to look at the potential growth in the market, how much is competition driving things or limiting growth. What are some policies that are in place to grow that area? Where's the customer base? What's the infrastructure look like? What's the quality of infrastructure and availability? What does the supply chain and logistics look like? And a number of other factors. Some of them can be as abstract as quality of life, which may have to do with crime and education. It depends on the project. Each project is completely different. And these are custom-built projects. It's not an off-the-shelf product that we have. We base a lot of our work on best practice from doing this for the past 30 years. We then work with our clients to build around their projects so that the solution is defined by the project. So the typical savings that we come across when we do this work is approximately a 20 to 30% savings. And some of that has to do with understanding the labor market that we're looking at. If there's if we're looking at a macro level analysis where we're looking at comparing cities in different states or across different regions of a country or even different countries, we're really going to want to look at the labor market and see what the impact of that is. It's probably one of the top things that is going to drive costs for our project. And the client's first tier issues revolve around many different things, and labor is a component. So free movement of capital, infrastructure, real estate availability and cost. Obviously, there's some incentives that can help balance out some of these costs, but labor is what we're going to be talking about today. In our methodology, we often roll out a phase development, and it depends on the maturity of the project. Sometimes we'll be lucky enough to be involved in the very early phases. We can, in the planning phase or in the justifying phase, when you're trying to understand how to make that justification pitch to your leadership about what the next steps could be or what the advantages of diversifying your real estate would be. That usually happens anywhere from 18 to 12 months in advance of a project, but sometimes, and that's what we call a phase one. We really got a lot of time we can invest and do some research. Oftentimes, the phase one, what we're seeing happen is we see an acute move that an organization needs to make, and that would be in a near term, let's say within the next 3 months or 6 months. And then after we've conducted that project and gotten that out of the way, we've developed a relationship with the client, and we then conduct kind of a site review for all their, or portfolio review of all their real estate, kind of bring that out and lay out the facts about where they could position themselves better. And then that usually becomes the phase one, but that's more of a longer term piece. The phase two micro site or macro site analysis is looking at major metropolitan areas and comparing these areas. We're comparing the Chicago metropolitan area, not just the city of Chicago, but the whole area to maybe Atlanta, and seeing which one is more favorable. When we get to a phase three microsite analysis, what we're talking about is looking at a parcel or a property address within those macro sites. So we're looking at maybe Alpharetta, Georgia, which is a suburb of Atlanta, and we know the exact address of a parcel of land that we think would be suitable for this project. We're comparing maybe 4 or 5 of these different parcels to each other within Atlanta. Some of them are over by the airport to the southwest of the city, some of them are north of the city. They all have different markets within the Atlanta market. So there's different people that can get to that facility quicker or faster or are willing to work at different salaries in order to do that work in those different parts of that smaller, that larger market. So that's what we call a phase three, a micro study. So, and then a phase four would be our site visits. They're kind of our final touch. It's basically getting our qualitative data set up. So the phase one is planning. Phase two is looking at things at a large scale, quantified data, statistical information. Phase three is looking at the distances away from a specific property or properties and comparing those. Sometimes, and a lot of times, we'll have a couple sites from one metropolitan area, like let's say Nashville, and be comparing that to Salt Lake City. But we'll be looking in a phase three about the specific properties and the distances and what comprises those properties in those separate markets. So phase three is a lot more detailed than phase two. The final phase is we've captured all of the quantitative data, the statistical information, and now we're trying to get that qualitative piece. We're going to the site. We're taking pictures of the site. We're meeting with key informants in the site, meaning maybe these are chambers of commerce or local human resources managers at key organizations in that community, and we're asking them questions like, why did you choose to stay or do business in this market? And we're gathering up this qualitative kind of anecdotal information and adding it to our phase two and phase three results. So now we have a full scope picture of what's happening in these markets. The desired outcome, obviously, is to reduce or eliminate subjectivity. Oftentimes, decisions are made amongst leadership where science is not necessarily driving the decision. Maybe there's some other reasons why people are choosing property. We've seen family-owned firms that choose property because it's close to their family, or they think that there's an investment in the property. We see that happen, and as the companies grow, they want to become more science-driven and specific about their selection of real estate and where they're doing business. Ultimately, the goal of this process is to not only eliminate subjectivity, but to involve the client in the process of discovering why certain addresses and certain markets are best to do for the project to do business in. And if the client team understands that information by going through this process, that's easier then to make a justified cause to the leadership about what the process involved and how those sites were chosen and selected over other sites. So measuring labor, let's go right into this. This is all what we're talking about. This is just the general piece about measuring labor. And we'll get into the rural piece in just a minute. But in the beginning, there was my friend Dr. John Snow in the upper left-hand corner of the screen. Dr. Snow was looking at an outbreak of cholera in London in the 1800s, and everyone thought the cholera was transmitted by sewer gas. And Dr. Snow thought that there was some other reason. And so what he did is he drew a map of the area, and he put down on the map as dots where his patients were, who were sick. And when he looked at this map, he noticed that there was a grouping or clustering of patients. And when he went to the center of the cluster, by connecting all the dots together, he found a pump. And the pump is in the upper left-hand corner next to Dr. Snow. And the pump happened to have been infected with the cholera bacteria. And what he did is he locked the pump up, and people started to get better. So what we're doing when we do a labor study is we're doing a lot of what Dr. Snow did. Instead of looking for people that are sick or looking for the cause of the illness, we're looking for the root cause of what's happening in the labor market in that particular location. We're counting up and evaluating the assets in that community around that location, and then comparing them both in terms of geography to other sites that we've selected, but also time. So we're looking at what happened a few years ago, what's happening today, and what's happening in the future. And we're using this information to interpolate or guess or scientifically evaluate what's between two known points. Maybe we don't have all the data we have continuously over the whole ecosystem of what we're looking at in terms of a map, but we're trying to fill in those gaps where we know we don't have a lot of great data. We have some data, and we can make inferences about what's happening in that area. This is what I call the nugget effect. And the reason why I call it the nugget effect is because about 150 years ago, there were scientists that were looking for gold nuggets. They would purchase large swaths of land in the United States or in Russia, and they would then have to figure out where they were going to dig for this gold. So what they do is they take some samples, and they do it at a regular basis. They pull the samples out, and the sample that they dug into the ground had indicators of gold, maybe some other stones and deposits that are in the soil that are common when you see gold. They would focus their digging and exploration activity in those areas. So that's why we call it the nugget effect. And what we're doing here is we're trying to find that nugget effect for your company in terms of labor. And when we're looking at rural sites, we really have, there's a lack of good data, quality data. So we use these techniques to interpolate and figure out what's happening in these areas where we have lower amount of data. And we also do something called ground truthing, which I'll talk about in a little bit later. So what happens in rural areas is we have to defeat the modifiable aerial unit problem. The modifiable aerial unit problem is where governments come in and they say, here's the county line. And you can be in one county and across the street can be another county. Well, I'll give you 3 guesses, and the first 2 don't count, about where we're seeing a lot of development in anywhere in the world. Well, it's between those 2 counties. So usually what you have is you have a county that has a population, and that population expands because there is a central tendency for people to live in cities. But as the metropolitan area expands, maybe there's additional elements that are attractive to living in that area. Maybe it's a policy element, okay? Maybe there's lower taxes, or if something makes it, some policy level decision is making it advantageous to do business in that location. What we see now is that a lot of those locations are expanding, and they're growing metropolitan areas, and the new development is happening at the edges of these metropolitan areas. So if we work with some economic developers and we say, boy, economic developing agency from city X, can you tell us how many people know how to operate forklifts in this area? They're going to give us the results, and it's going to measure only the people that are in their area. What we want to know, because we're developing a site that across the street is another totally different area, we want to understand what's happening around that area, around our facility, on both sides of the county. So in county X and in county Y. And we also know that these are large areas. They might be cities, but we'll use the county or province, maybe even the state sometimes. I'm working a lot of work in the Midwest where we see cities that span 2 states. We're going to have to work with 2 agencies. And we know that not everybody in that county can get to our facility. So there are people, because we're at the edge of the county, and maybe the people from the center of the county and closest to us can get to us, but get to our facility. But the people on the other side of the county are not going to drive through the entire county to get to the facility. So we need to be able to look at this geographically. How many people can physically get to our facility? Not just people. We want to look at demographics, but we also want to look at the skill sets of people and the wages that that those skill sets pay in those areas. This is what we call a labor shed. So oftentimes labor sheds will go beyond county, city, state boundaries. And this is what we call the modifiable aerial unit problem, is if we ask the question, how many people live in this county? We'll get an answer, but we won't get the answer for the people that can effectively get to our facility, because not everybody in that county can get to that facility. And that's really what the modifiable aerial unit problem is, that populations aren't evenly dispersed in space. Some innovations that we use are big data and visualization solutions. I need to talk a little bit about the GIS, which we've spoken about a little bit, but GIS stands for Geographic Information Systems. And it's something that we use in a lot of our work. And you see this map in the left-hand side of the screen. What we see is drive times, meaning how fast somebody can drive on the road in distances, versus and as the crow flies circles. So those circles and the drive times, the corresponding colors, you see the inner color is kind of a red color, and there's a circle that goes around it. Well, the circle looks pretty circular, and the red color does not look circular. And as we get farther out, we see there's a blue circle that goes all the way around this metro area, and a very abstract-looking shape. Now, these are the people that live an hour away from this facility. And you can see not everybody within the circle can get to that facility in the same amount of time. And actually, there are people that can live farther away from the facility than that circle area, and that's just because they live next to an interstate. So if you live on a fast road, you can drive across metropolitan areas very quickly, as opposed to driving on residential streets. So this is one of the theories that we use when we deploy our labor sheds, and we use geographic information systems to do that. We also do heat mapping, and we look at the various clusters of people, and sometimes we can even look at your employee base. If you wanted to know how many employees you could retain if you moved your facility 20 miles down the road, we can look at that, and we do that oftentimes with heat maps and by mapping your employee base. We look at social media, and we mine social media for the types of jobs and wages and job descriptions, and as well as employer proximity to a facility and what's happening at that employer. So, for example, their total employment, the number of jobs they have, how many jobs they're hiring for recently, and what their hiring trends are in the past, and what the skill sets they're looking for. So these are all things we can capture from social media. And then what happens is we usually collect lots of data. I just did a project where we were looking at 500 different sites, and we had over 50 variables. Well, when you do the math, it ends up being 20,000 different comparisons. How do you make sense of 20,000 different comparisons? Well, you can run the statistics and then rank things. We also do some visualizing of table data. So we use the same process that scientists use when they're sequencing DNA, when they're looking at changes in DNA. And it's a visual thing called conditional formatting. And what it does is not only it assigns a number value to the result, but it assigns a color to the result. And this is on the lower left-hand side of the screen. We see some of that intensity in terms of results, table results in number value as well as color value that are desirable for this project. And here's a common site selection matrix. What we're trying to do is organize all this information into one place. In the planning stages, these end up being general, very general documents, and they get more specific as we get closer to the phase 2, which is our macro level analysis, and then very, very specific once we get to phase 3, which is our micro level. We're actually looking at properties and assets within and around those properties. So when we conduct our matrix and we develop it, we also weigh the variables. So not every variable is equal to every other variable. We might have a project where we're very sensitive about labor availability, meaning we need a certain number of people to work at our facility every day, and we're less sensitive to pay. So wages, we might want to reduce the weight that are put into wages. We might be willing to pay a 10 or 15 or 20% premium on labor if we can find the right labor. And the core is understanding what those fundamentals are and how to weigh them in our matrices. So how we do that is we conduct a best practice review within our organization, within Dickey & Associates. We also listen to you as a client and your needs of your project and your former experience with doing these kind of projects. What was successful, what was not successful. We put that into a model and we build a foundation. And then we bring that forth to you through periodic review. Like maybe let's say it happens once a week or every other week. When we do that, then we'll refine the model iteratively until we're at a point where we think this is really what we want everything to represent and how it's going to be measured. And that's when we start populating the matrix with a lot of information and capturing a lot of data, and very fine data with high fidelity at each site. So again, here's the macro level matrix where we're looking at major metropolitan areas. And then a micro is going to be many different sites, and everything is very finely high fidelity, measuring from a distance around that site. So we're capturing the number of people, the educational attainment around that area, the types of jobs, the number of persons that are available with those skill sets, and the wages in those areas. This has all been summarized and synthesized into a report, including an executive summary that really gets down to brass tacks about what we're trying to say. Ultimately, the decision on what to do is up to our client. We advise the client about the various elements within the site that are both advantageous and less desirable. And here's a little case study of sites that we looked at where we didn't, we were able to measure assets within the site. So we looked at comparing two communities. One is in green and the other in yellow. What we did is we divided these sites up into equal grid cells, 1 mile grid cells, and we're counting up assets within the grid cell. And what do you mean by an asset, Kevin? Well, I'll tell you. We're looking at the total number of highway miles in each cell, then the number of exits that are there. And this particular project was a grocery store or food store. So we looked at competitors in the various different tiers of grocers and food stores. I mean, a food store would be like maybe a smaller version of a grocery store. A grocery store might, a supermarket might be even larger. So it's the number of services. Like a supermarket is going to have a deli counter and a bakery. Grocer might not have a bakery but have a deli counter. And a food store is just going to have prepackaged food. Then we want to look at maybe superstores because we know that Target and Walmart are expanding their grocery options in a lot of communities. And we're looking at maybe mall space, so people want to shop at the same time, so they're going to go shopping first for clothes and then over to the grocery store. We're trying to get this where the consumers are aggregating in the community. We're looking at the target demographics, age 25 to 55, and then any kind of grocery option. So all these things are being collected. Here's population density and households. And we're coming up with a composite score then. What we're doing is we're stacking all of those different measures on top of each other. And we're adding them up. So we're saying which are most desirable, which are kind of middle desirability, and then the lowest suitability, which might be, in this case, we see the composite map. The darkest areas are the most suitable for our project. And each one of those is weighted, so we know where things that we're collecting all the data, but some things are more important than other things, and so that's being also factored into this model. They're being stacked up on top of each other and analyzed, and we can really get some great information about what's happening in the community, and as well reduce that subjectivity. So, assessing labor and site selection, this is an important part. You see from the graph, the pie chart on the left, that labor is a huge chunk of operating costs. We also, real estate costs and taxes and utilities, but oftentimes those are fractional compared to the labor cost. And within labor, there's a number of different costs. There's unemployment insurance, Social Security. We're looking at fringe benefits and 401ks, and there's costs that are in addition to wages. And we can also evaluate these. So our approach is to investigate all aspects of the community and look at these demographics and attributes within that community. And to gather data from multiple sources, we look at government data. We subscribe to sources that are kind of they're separate from government data. They're done with a little bit more intent. We look at independent studies. Perhaps it's a local jurisdiction that did a transportation study or is in a transportation improvement plan, looking for things like, are they going to widen the road, or is bus service going to be expanded to this new area? And we also conduct our primary research. So what I like to do is say that oftentimes some of these data will be similar. So maybe the independent study is a labor study that has to do with wages, but we can also get wage data from the government and from our subscription services, and at the same time we might be conducting qualitative interviews with human resource managers in the area. By the way, all those qualitative interviews, there's an NDA in place for those interviewees are not aware of who our clients are or what the purpose exactly is. We're just trying to understand why that company selected the community to do business in and to continue to do business in. So these are key drivers. All of this information then is synthesized, and it's brought together in a similar place, and we're looking for a specific agreement between all these different sources of information. If we see that 3 of 4 sources say labor is going to be more expensive 10 years from now, and one source that says it isn't, we're going to try to explain why that source is saying that that it's coming to a different conclusion than the other 3 sources. I like to say that this is kind of like a stool that has 4 legs. It's very hard for that stool to accidentally fall over. If we have a stool with just 1 or 2 legs, that stool is not going to be able to stand up on its own. Somebody's going to have to hold it. It's going to fall over. And I like to have agreement between my data sets. But I like to have different perspectives. So when we talk with human resources managers, we're actually getting them to tell a story of why they chose that community to do business in. When we're looking at government sources data, we're getting very factual information. Those are 2 different things. They might very well agree with each other, but they're 2 different perspectives. And we think those perspectives help explain the justification for making the selections in some of these site projects. So our in-market research, again, we look at interviews with existing area employers and other key informants. Maybe there's people at local technical colleges, maybe there's a university there, maybe there's some economic developers. Again, all of this is done with an NDA in place. It's just kind of getting general understanding of the environment. For example, does the community college offer training in animation? If we're looking at doing film credits, how many of those students are graduating each year and maybe entering the workforce and might be able to work for our company as we develop maybe animated films or do TV commercials? So these are all sorts of things that we're going to look at and compile. Our labor catchment areas or our labor sheds, we've already kind of talked about some of this information in terms of putting it together. Here's this map again where we see the drive times and the as the crow flies, quote unquote, circles around where those areas are and how they don't line up totally. Meaning, if you are located close to an interstate, you can probably go farther, faster away from that facility or towards the facility than an area that just has residential roads, or some areas that don't have any roads. It's just you're going to have to go around a mountain or a body of water. These are all things we want to keep in mind. Those are barriers to for our population of workers to get to our facility. We're going to try to evaluate those before we get too far along in these projects, so that you can understand what the general populations are that are readily available to you as an employer in that area. We're going to look at this in terms of traffic as well. What I do is I model this at a Thursday morning, the busiest travel day of the week, in rush hour to the facility. At the end of the day, we don't really mind. People get to leave work at 5 o'clock, and it might take them 2 hours to get home. It might take them 30 minutes. Really, what we want to understand is how long it's going to take them to get to work, not to get home from work. We can control the leaving aspect. We can't control the arriving aspect as much. And so that's why we look at traffic patterns and traffic conditions on average Thursdays to do this work. We build our labor shed. We quantify the labor shed using these stacked variables and composite scores and weighted overlay averages. And then here's an example of why you'd want to do that. We were looking for working for a company that was evaluating 2 sites. They were both in rural areas, and they said, well, we think we're operating at site A, and we think we want to move to site B. And they say, they looked at the data, and they said, boy, site A is so much better than site B, but we don't have enough fidelity to really make that decision. So what we went back is we looked at several other markets, and we looked at these, and we said, boy, site A and B are way here at the bottom of this chart. They're straight lines. Yeah, there's one that's better than the other, but we can compare them to other markets. The other markets are operating so much more efficiently. So is it really worth the effort and risk to move from site A to site B? The answer in this case was no. that there was too much risk to relocate, and that we would want to put our resources in some of these other markets, or try to fix the challenges at Site A. Maybe there are employment challenges, and I think they were actually, where the company was having trouble keeping good quality people working at the facility. So we tried to improve that. It worked. The company's now happy at Site A. They didn't have to risk moving to a new site, hiring a completely new workforce, and acquiring new real estate in that market. Oftentimes, we also want to look at these trends over time. So not just one site compared to another site, but we want to look at one site compared to another as it was in the past, in the present, and the future. So these are maybe Site A and Site B are wages and labor costs. And we see that in the past, Site A has been more expensive than Site B. Currently, Site A is more expensive than Site B in 2017. But as we start looking at 10 years down in the future, we see that these roles are reversed. We want to understand those trends before the decision to locate at Site B takes place, and advise our clients on those things that they need to be careful about or be watchful of or concerned with, because we can look at this performance over time and help you understand what markets, how markets are changing and why they're changing. And just quickly, a few more things that we need to pay attention to when we look at rural areas is obviously the supply chain. Transportation is going to be a big factor in a lot of this. Farther out from the market we are, the more expensive our transportation costs are going to be to get product to market. So we want to understand the way that affects our model, in addition to this, the labor. So looking at those different metrics. Obviously, we want to find that Goldilocks zone with the best fit strategy. Here we look at our distribution centers and our stores that we're supplying to. And in this case, we wanted to remove a distribution center from Michigan and see how that affects the shipping costs at our stores with the remaining distribution centers. I'll just kind of go back and forth on these two. So we took out the Detroit facility, and now the other facilities, which are located much farther away, need to take up that role for that facility and ship to those stores. So we understand that with both the international level. So these are distribution centers throughout North America, including the United States and Mexico. But we can also look at it at a local level, just within a region. Maybe it goes across state lines, and maybe it doesn't. And then finally, economic development incentives. We help research those incentives. We quantify them. We present them to you so we know what the terms and conditions are and what the benefits are. We negotiate them if that's possible. Some are set up so they're not able to negotiate. Others, we do have the ability to negotiate them. And then we also have a process in place to help you understand the legal constructs of those agreements. And then finally, we have some aftercare as well. So we help manage that incentive. So maybe some on a quarterly basis or on an annual basis, there's reporting that's necessary, meaning like how many people you've hired. A lot of it's job related. So how many people you've hired, what's the wages that they're making, and there's maybe even some other criteria, CDBG grants, community development block grants, have to benefit certain populations, meaning like that maybe there's populations that are a little bit less wealthy, so we have to demonstrate that that population is being benefited. This is all done as part of the aftercare and compliance part of the incentives. So I would like to open this up for questions now. If you have any questions, you can use the little chat feature in the upper right-hand corner of your WebEx window, and please just chat in any kind of questions. I have been collecting them as we go along. Today we've been talking about labor and quantifying labor in rural areas for site selection projects. We've gone through a couple of examples. We've talked about the process as well as what happens in what we want to measure and how this is presented. And on the screen now, you'll see our contact information. So if you don't have a question at this moment and you'd like to contact us, please send us an email at info@hickey&associates.com. You can visit our webpage at hickey&associates.com. We're also on Twitter and LinkedIn. We encourage you to go check out those web pages, and if you have any questions, to let us know. So we have a first question: how long does a labor study take to complete? That's a great question. So earlier I talked about those phases of development in our work. One of the first phase is oftentimes after we've been working with a client for a while, so it's our research phase. Annually, we generally conduct a portfolio review, and even then, once we've done that portfolio review, sometimes our clients have 40, 50, 60, hundreds of different properties. Sometimes they just have 5 properties. That's okay. Each client and each project is totally different. So my point is that sometimes we come in very early on the project. We can get started a year in advance. We can talk about leases that are up in 18 months and which ones we should be looking at repositioning. Sometimes this is the conversation around should we move or not has already taken place in the boardroom or within the organization, and things have matured beyond the level of just looking at a portfolio review, but there's an acute project that we are brought in to help with. That sometimes can be done in 6 weeks or 4 weeks, sometimes even less. It depends on the project. So some projects, when we're just collecting some real basic data, we can get done within a couple of hours or even a couple of days. Other projects where we want to do the qualitative data in addition to the quantitative information take much longer and up to 6 weeks, 6 to 8 weeks at times. But I don't want to scare anybody off. This is all it's all flexible and can be scaled to the time and the scope of the project as well. Any other questions? Oh, here's a question about the NDA process and talking with human resources. Again, so what we do when we do qualitative data is we work with economic developers to help us identify key informants, and by key informant I mean human resources managers or leaders of companies or leaders of organizations within the community who may have a specialized perspective on labor and real estate in the community and business development in that community. We're speaking with these individuals. We have a survey tool that we ask them pretty routine questions. Again, they're not specific enough where they would know anything about the type of business that we're conducting or planning to conduct in terms of your project. What we're asking them is just what makes the community tick. Why is this a good place to do business? Oftentimes, we're linked to informants that have recently located in the community. So we're asking them questions like, why did you choose this community when you could have moved anywhere in the world? And these are the sorts of information that we're trying to gather. And we're also asking them about their workforce. How long are commutes and who drives from where? And do we have both working families? So we have mom and dad. Are they both working? Is English a language that's spoken? Are there places to eat and get gas close to your facility or in the community so that workers can go and get lunch and fill up their gas tank after they leave work as opposed to on their way to work? All these kind of things are questions that we're answering, but they're mostly to get the pulse of what's happening in the community. So the final question I have here is how involved does the client have to be in any of this work? And the answer again is as each project is different, it's as involved as you can afford to be. So some clients want just a passive portfolio review to be done annually, and for us to look and advise on which markets the leases might be expiring and where they might want to think about repositioning themselves in which markets. Maybe they want to consolidate 2 locations into one. We do that, and then we just advise the client in a report. Other times the client really wants to be involved in the work. That can be done on a daily basis. I've been working with clients where they call me every day at 2 o'clock, and we talk a little bit about what we've learned over the past 24 hours. Other times, my preference is to schedule a once a week or every other week meeting and to have a report that's generated, just a brief report, maybe 1 or 2 pages, and just kind of give the clients an update about what's happening. It's oftentimes a very good process to have regular conversations with our clients as we learn more, even before we come to final conclusions, because this will help the clients understand the information, justify some of the reasons why we're eliminating some sites or maybe looking for additional information in a specific location that's tailored to the project. And it helps the client understand overall the case for justifying the site selection effort. And not only the effort, but the outcome of the effort, which is to arrive at the best place to do business. Again, these are great questions. Thank you, everyone, for participating in this webinar. My name is Kevin Gibbs. I'm a director with Hickey & Associates, and today we've been talking about labor analytics for rural areas and why we'd want to do that, and what's involved, and what are the things we need to think about, the timelines, what we're talking about when we're doing projects on that scope. I thank everyone for joining us. And this time I'm going to conclude the webinar, and I wish you the best of luck. If you have any questions and you haven't been able to ask them right now, please visit us at hickeyindassociates.com. Thank you.